Today, I'm very excited to have Leon Conrad on the show. Leon, I'm just going to read the bio that sent me, or I got off of his website. Hello, I'm Leon Conrad. I'm an entertaining and knowledgeable writer and lecturer, a sensitive story structure consultant and editor who helps writers craft their work at every stage of the writing process. A top end traditional tutor who helps students get into highly competitive schools, an inspiring voice centered communication skills coach who helps people improve their voice use, public speaking, and presentation skills, and a detail loving designer who creates historically inspired embroidery designs that intrigue and engage. Interesting. So, welcome to the program, Leon.
Thank you, Marla.
Yeah, and for my listeners, Leon reached out to me, and we kind of went back and forth if this topic, it's unusual for this show, but it's really not, because storytelling isn't that what our lives are all about. Who was it that said life is just a stage? I think it was Shakespeare or someone.
That's right.
Someone
And all
important
the
like
players on it, yes.
yeah, someone important. Raymond Moody loves to say, we're just this play that's going on, and we're just actors coming on and off. And I tend to believe that. So let's just jump right in. How did you get so involved with storytelling? Did it start as a child?
Absolutely. It started out when, well, let me take my steps back in time. My mother used to read to me a lot. It was more reading books than making up stories, but
Mm,
she had a voice that brought these stories to life. And I noticed it with my own daughter. There was something about a particular story and the way I read it. If I would read it in a way that she wasn't expecting and wasn't enjoying, she would say, "No, no, no, Daddy, do it again properly." There's something, yeah, there's something about embodying your story in your voice, in your very being, and
mm,
bringing it to life that engages with the imagination. That's what I remember from my earliest encounters with my mother reading a book. The earliest one I remember is A, apple pie, B, bit it, C, cut it. And you get the alliteration, you get the
yes.
sounds and the physicality of the language. When I was in going into middle school, you'd call it in the States, I had the great good fortune to have a lesson where my maths teacher was off sick. Poor maths teacher, but great for us. The headmaster was an enlightened headmaster who knew every member of his staff and what their capabilities and talents were. He also knew that many people on that day were off sick. There was a bug going around. And he had to find somebody to look after my class. It was the worst class in the school. It had the worst reputation. And he knew the only person who could keep us in check for 45 minutes for that lesson was one of his cleaners. So he went down the stairs, roamed the corridors, found her, and said, "Look, that lesson before the lunch, 5G, I know, I know, I know, but I know I can rely on you." And she came in. Well, a cleaner, a woman in a Islamic headgear thing. We were just going to run riot until she said, with a voice that you had to listen to, "Would you like me to tell you a story?" We thought, can't say no to that. We're not going to be
Hmm.
taught anything. Why not? And then she asked, "What would you like me to tell you the story about?" That got our attention because she was engaging us. Very few teachers engaged us in those days. And hands went up all round the classroom. And she chose 3 or 4 ideas and spun a story straight from an oral tradition of the Arabian Nights, leaving us on a cliffhanger just before the bell went for recess. I couldn't tell you what the story was, but I remember to this day the feeling that she created just spinning a story. We were spellbound. And I remember thinking at that point, I don't care what they teach us in school. I want to learn what you can do, because that has power.
Beautiful. And is that what you went on to study? What did you do with that
Eventually,
knowledge?
eventually, she came back a year later. Everyone immediately was quiet. It was a similar situation. The maths teacher was off sick. We couldn't remember what we'd been taught the previous lesson, let alone the maths lesson we'd had the previous week. Everyone could remember what she had told us the year before. She said, I see that I must have told you a story before. Where did we leave it last time? And a few hands went up. She got the threads of the cliffhanger where she'd left it, and yet again spun an improvised story, leaving us on another cliffhanger in a tradition that comes from a living oral tradition of the
Yes.
Arabian Nights that she was part of. And that's the last time I saw her.
Mhm.
It took me 40 years to find somebody from a different oral tradition who was willing to train me as an oral storyteller. And
It,
that's what I've been doing for the last 7 years. I also have been engaging in a big research project to look into how story works and why stories, if that makes sense to you.
mhm. No, no, it does make sense to me. I've always been a huge fan of storytelling festivals. I remember going to one in Oakland, and it's sort of like the cleaning person who came into your classroom. I can't tell you exactly what Greek mythology story it was, but it stayed with me forever. And after that, I actually took a storytelling class, and
Mm-hmm.
I loved it. And I would venture to say it's a lost art, but I don't think it is, because I think it's very much coming back. And it's just so simple. And how do you feel, just to go off topic for sort of off topic for a second, that kids are now listening to stories on tablets, or as they're watching, animation on a computer or something like that? How do you feel about that, or what that does for a child compared with the sort of storytelling that you're talking about?
It's a difficult one. I grew up in the days before computers, and I feel that reading a book or having a book read to you, or even listening to a story, even better, allows the imagination to fire up. You see the pictures that you create in your own imagination, which you don't do if you engage with a story that is already prepackaged visually for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the difference. I don't think there's anything wrong in watching a film or engaging with a story on the computer or listening to an audiobook. Great. But when it becomes a substitute for the age old traditions of storytelling, when it becomes a substitute for a live encounter with a storyteller who has at least 4,000 stories in them that they can draw up to fit the demands of the occasion, they will tell you a story that you need to hear at that moment because they have the wisdom to do so.
Mm-hmm.
That's not something you're going to get from a computer.
Right. How do you feel about, I learned this from, my children went to the Waldorf school, and talking about A, B, and C's, that they put an art component in there too, not only the crispness of possibly a C with cat, or, of different letters, but an art component, but also learning that when you want to maybe teach a lesson to a young one, that you make up a story that is with a different character, of course, but has a very similar challenge that possibly the child is having. And it seemed to work. It it was kind of magic. How do you can you talk about that a little bit?
Stories, I think, are ways in which we can reflect ourselves in a way that makes things that might seem uncomfortable if we had a direct confrontation with them,
Mhm,
makes them seem okay to deal with. In the Renaissance and in many other times, Aesop's fables were used as
mhm.
ways of being able to talk about sensitive topics that you would not have been able to deal with directly. That's just one example of how it's not just relevant to children, it's relevant to adult everyday lives.
How
But
does one
there's a,
go
sorry,
ahead?
Marla,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
there's a question which is burning inside me that I'd like to ask you, which is, what do you understand by story?
What do I understand by story? I understand that story is a beautiful way to engage, to spend time with someone else, and to use imagination, magic, mystery to open up the senses, to bring forth the imagination, to inspire, get people excited about making up their own stories and finding more. And that does, what does that do? Increase neuroplasticity in the brain. It helps in every single thing you do on this earthly realm. And it's just beautiful.
I agree. But let me unpick that answer because it's going to help me explain how I view story a bit differently to other people and other writers who have talked about story or written about story. You mentioned two aspects to story. One is the experience of story, that phenomenon that does something to the way we think. It changes our frame of reference in terms of time and space, it expands it, and we enter a different mode of being when
Mhm.
we are in story. But then there are also stories. You've said experiencing that encourages people to tell stories, to engage with stories. And those are the creations. Without those creations, we wouldn't be able to enter that dimension of story. But it's the dimension of story that I am interested in primarily. That's what I focus on, that state of mind. And it's a very difficult thing to map. Obviously, you need a story to follow to find out what's going on behind it. But I was lucky enough to meet a venerable academic, Professor George Spencer Brown, who had written a book in the 1960s. It was first published in 1969 called Laws of Form. In it, he laid out with incredible simplicity the patterns we use when we express something in language, when we express something in logic, when we express something in mathematics. And he does it with 6 simple symbols that are very visually intuitive. I've used those symbols to chart the patterns of thought that give rise to different kinds of stories. And it's those patterns of thought that I'm interested in because story comes to life in the imagination. Story arises out of our mind And that's where it goes back to when a story closes. These patterns are embodied within us. And if we can understand the differences in the patterns that give rise to different kinds of stories, then we can understand more about ourselves. Over to you.
Over to me. So, patterns of thought. So, let's make this really simple. If a listener is listening to this right now and they're thinking, which I would be thinking if I had a little one, I need to tell more stories. So what are these patterns of thought? So
Mhm.
where would I start? Where would I begin? So kind of away, a little bit away from the academic writing and that jumping into the really heavy duty structure. What are these patterns of thought, and how would one use this to help start? Because what I would do as a young mom, well, I was an old mom, I had young children, I would read stories. And then from the stories that I loved, I would create my own stories,
Mhm.
and I would bring in the characters or, the themes or the lessons that I wanted to bring into the children. And the kids loved it. So, how would you suggest to one that's interested in that to begin their own storytelling?
I'm so glad you asked me to do it in a non-academic way, because that is what I love doing. I do have an academic bent, and the book I wrote, Story and Structure, is deliberately written in a way that will appeal both to academics, because it's rigorously researched and footnoted, but also it's written in a way that will appeal to the parent who wants to tell a story to their child, or just wants to engage a bit more with what makes story story, in the sense of both a noun, a thing, and a verb, an action that takes place through time. So, to make it very simple, there's a very popular game called Fortunately, Unfortunately, we could play. And in 6 moves, we're going to tell a story from beginning to end. Are you up for playing?
Sure.
Good. So you get to choose a character. You get to choose whether they start fortunately or unfortunately. And I get to choose whether they end up in a happy situation, whether it's a happy ending or a tragic ending. We shall see. And all we do is take it in turns. If you start with a character in a fortunate situation, then my next turn is to take it unfortunately. And we'll go for
So,
6 or 7 moves.
okay, so I not only say fortunate or unfortunate, I tell you what the situation is also.
Yes. So I need
Okay.
a who, when, where. A character in some kind of space at some kind of time.
Okay. Okay, so I will begin with a, can my character be an animal?
Yeah.
Okay. So I need to plug in my computer here. Wait 1 second. So I'm going to begin with a young piglet, and this piglet lives has had to move to the city because it grew up on a farm, but unusual, unfortunate circumstances insisted that the piglet move into the city where he is scared and unsure of himself, and he's living with his aunt who is busy all the time and can't really give him the nourishment that he needs. Is that enough?
Yeah. Fortunately, the aunt
I love that. Go ahead.
the aunt, because she's so busy, because she's at work all the time and has this little piglet who's running amok and needs supervising, has contacted a friend of hers who is the pig community's storyteller. And she says, all right, I will come and watch over this little cousin of yours. I'll keep them entertained. Don't you worry about a thing.
However, unfortunately, this friend that was going to watch over the little piglet loved to open up a book and have the piglets read with them and go in a circle. But this little piglet had never been taught to read. He had been taught to live on the farm and play and run and sing and even knit. He was one of the few piglets that could knit on the little farm, but he had never been taught to read. So he was embarrassed and and didn't know what to do.
Fortunately, the storyteller pig was very experienced with the ways of young country pigs. And she had brought a picture book just in case the piglet didn't know how to read the words. And she just said, tell me about the pictures. Let's look at them together.
Mm.
And the pages were turned and the story unfolded and the words came out and filled their imaginations. And the pig started talking about his life back at the farm, and knitting came up.
Well, unfortunately, knitting did come up, which really excited him. However, the last beautiful little mittens he had knitted were for his favorite friend that was left back at the farm. And this brought about so much sadness of just wanting to be back on the farm. And he started getting teary-eyed, and once again he was scared and just felt so uncomfortable in his circumstances.
Fortunately, the storyteller was able, through a process of getting to know the little piggy over time, show him that not only could he make a new pair of mittens because she brought him a pair of knitting needles and some wool, but also learn to write letters that he could send back to his friend at the farm. And he would be able to read the answers that came back. For even though his little friend didn't know how to read and write, the storyteller knew someone at the farm that could, like an ancient Egyptian scribe, read her letters, tell them to the little pigs, hear their answers, write the answers down, and send the answers back in written form. And over time, the little pig who loved knitting, loved stories, became one of the best knitted clothing designers in the city.
And had enough money to go back to the farm and visit and bought their
There
own
you go.
little farm. Oh, that's fortunate.
Yeah, there you go. We did it.
Very fun. Very fun. Yeah, I love stuff
So
like that.
it doesn't take much.
Yes.
And what we did was tell an extended quest structure story. It was expanded. Every one of those pairs of moves can be expanded further because
Mm-hmm.
every one contains 6 main elements. The quest structure is formula number 1, a who, when, where, in what condition. Number 2, they have a problem. As a result of that problem, they go on a journey. That's number 3. Number 4, they have a meeting which stops them in their tracks. The tension builds. And that meeting is usually with a friend or helper. That friend or helper will give them something, either advice or some kind of tool or magical object that will enable them to go forward on their quest. Number 5 is the meeting with the enemy or hindrance that they have to overcome in order to solve their problem. Once they've done that, they get to number 6, which is the outcome or resolution. If there is an outcome that hasn't yet solved the initial problem, then you loop back and you go through the steps again. And
Mm.
stories, which is what we did very often, have this try, try, try again pattern. Why we like things in 3, I don't know. We have 3 blind mice, 3 wise men. You can't have a number 1 without it having a beginning, middle, and end.
Mm.
Triplicity is part of our embodied way of engaging with the universe and the environment around us. Past, present, future. 3 persons, first person, second person, third person. I, you, he, she, it. And sorry, what was I going to say? That is the quest structure.
Yeah, that's
Those little moves that if you feel the energy, the ebb and flow, you don't need the words. You can just flow with it. And that is where story comes to life in you.
mhm. That's beautiful. And number 3 is very big in spirituality. I mean, you think of um, oh gosh, many different things, but not that I can really. All I can think of right now is the thing that the Catholics
Well, the
that
Trinity in
yeah, the
Christianity.
Trinity, that's what it's called. I was raised Christian, the Trinity.
Mhm.
Yes, but many other things. And what I like about this too is that you could bring it into, we talk on the show a lot about the importance of ceremony and rituals. If you don't like those words, you can use initiations, whatever you may use for the young, because we don't, in the Western world, we don't have much of that anymore. And hopefully it's coming back to be able to sit down in a circle of children and start and do something like what you and I just did in a small circle and really create the create an opportunity for, I guess I'll call it imagination. Yeah, imagination. And I had a wonderful medium on the show. He's from the UK and he's very well, Bill Thompson, very well known. And he was talking about being a young child, and his friend's mom would sort of do what we're talking about right now. And that's what started him on it, really his spiritual path, to be able to go, as you talk, kind of into that different, I'll even use the word realm, and you could bring kind of mystical stuff into it too.
There is,
For example, very young children can see spirit. Many talk about it, like if grandpa passes and grandpa's in the room, and you could even create some things to make it easier to talk about, and just not justified, but you know what I'm saying, validated, I guess is the word I want to use,
Mhm.
which is really beautiful too.
I talk quite a bit in my book of story as being part of or involved in rites of passage.
Yes.
These are very important, as are threshold crossings. I talk a bit more about that in my book. There are threshold crossings that we must cross a threshold when we go into story and when we come out of it. That
Hmm.
is what the function of the once upon a time traditional openings and they lived happily after traditional closings. That's their function. That's what they do. They take us into the world of story and back out of it again.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about those openings and closings, which I respect and I put at the beginning and end of every structure I map in the book graphically, is that they are composed in a way that warps our sense of space and time. Just think of once upon a time. Once is, well, when exactly is that? Upon, okay, I'm putting something on something else. But what is it I'm putting? And where am I putting it? I'm putting it on a time. And by this time, my mind is suitably muddled up to allow me to enter story space.
Yeah.
That's the function. It forms a very quick hypnotic move
Mm-hmm.
that takes us into an altered mind space. Within that mind space, we can make sense of things much more easily than if we are in a rational mindset. Not that there's anything wrong with a rational mindset. We do need to think logically, and there is logic in story. But it also opens up our way of thinking to the imagination. In story, there are threshold crossings within the story space. And what's interesting, what I found through analyzing story structure in the way I've done, is that very often the threshold crossings are between the metaphysical dimension of being, where angels or demons
Mm-hmm.
exist, and the physical dimension of being, where human beings exist. There is, it seems, as far as we know from story, a connection between those dimensions. When there is a sense of there being an excess of something in one dimension of being, let's say the human dimension of being, if somebody's gone overboard, if there's an excess of evil, then somehow that vibration carries across the threshold to the metaphysical dimension of being. And lo and behold, that is when angels appear. Look at what happened to Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith. The angel who appeared to him in the most horrible, filthiest dungeon at the time, the Black Pit of Tehran. Boethius writes the consolation of philosophy when he is at his lowest point, and that is when the spirit of philosophy visits him. He's visited by this metaphysical figure. And this is what happens in story. It's like we have this inner strong point, inner savior character
Mm-hmm.
that will come to us at our hour of darkest need. And we can unlock this by engaging with story through our imagination. I don't know what form it will come in. Maybe it's our inner instinct. Maybe it's a guardian angel. Maybe it's
Earth
something
angel.
else. But I can recognize the quality of that experience as being otherworldly, but embodied in my physical being.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of having to have words to describe what is actually ineffable, we have story, which makes it graspable. If you come too near the mystery, it escapes. If you have story, you have a transparent veil through which you can look to see what is beyond. But don't try to break the veil and reach your hand through.
Right.
It is meant to be mystery.
It's interesting because just the other night, I'm not sure when this will air, but it's getting closer to Christmas, and there was something on about It's a Wonderful Life and how it's one of the best Christmas stories. And in that, an angel comes at the deepest, darkest moment of the guy's life. I can't remember his name, but I just I just thought of that. But with everything you said, which was so beautiful and wonderfully articulated, it also opens up, I feel, in a child's mind, well, not just a child, an adult, the inner child, right? That this does happen. This does in real life. I can kind of reach for my angel, the angels I heard about in the stories. Of course, if you have it just opens up a lot of possibilities, even when you leave the realm of storytelling to bring into your earthly life to be a more evolved, if you will, or just a little bit more soulful. Do you agree?
I do. I'm very wary of talking too much about it or trying
Mm-hmm.
to put it into too many words. I have a great respect for putting it into story and letting it speak for itself.
Yes, yes. Let it kind of marinate and yeah. And that's not really what you're about, but just saying that is just a beautiful way to look at it. So Leon, what would you like to say to the listeners today? What do you want to shout to the world about your storytelling and your beautiful book? What is the name of your book again?
The book is called Story and Structure, and it is beautiful, not because I wrote it, but because it had the input of two very, very talented and wonderful people. The designer of the book, Teresa Monachino, who is a glorious designer who made it look beautiful.
Do you have a copy
And
of it right
I
there?
do have a copy of it. Yes, let me show you. Is this going out on Zoom? Yeah,
Yes.
there you go.
Our
Right, that's
YouTube.
the paperback. And
Nice.
this is
Can
the
you put it up again? Keep talk as you put it up because then
this
you'll
is
come
the
up.
hardback.
Okay.
It's called
Okay.
Story and Structure, a Complete Guide, and it's illustrated by Jason Chang, who is a wonderful artist who's done pictures for
Mm,
every chapter. And there's a story that goes through the book so people can engage on an imaginative level with what's going on in the text and just let their imaginations lead them to wherever it wants to take them.
so it's not just an academic book, it's a
It is
story.
absolutely not. It is deliberately pitched to straddle both those interested in the academic side of how story works
Yeah.
and those interested in the practical side of how story works.
Mm,
If you're the kind of person who has engaged with books by Joseph Campbell, Christopher Booker, you will find a lot in this book that will add to that information, those authors' works, and carries it forward.
beautiful. And that's how it's different. That's how your work
Yeah, I
is
show
different
for
than
the first
others.
yeah, I show for the first time that the formal poetic shapes we have, like limericks or sonnets or haikus, have those forms because they follow a particular story structure.
Hmm.
And knowing what story structure is adds to your appreciation of what those forms are doing. Nobody's shown that before.
Right.
And if
Wow.
people want to engage with the structures just to become better storytellers to their kids at home, to be able to improvise, to relax into a story, not have to think too much about it, then I run courses. I run courses for writers, and I work one to one with writers, playwrights, business people who want to tell their business stories as well, shaping at every level, whether it's conceptual, whether it's presentation, how story structure can inform what they do, how they do it, so the story can flow along well oiled tracks.
Yes. And when you talk about stories, some people just immediately think opening up a book or, telling a story. But really, for example, my husband's a lawyer and he always loved in college acting. And And really, every time we open our mouths, almost we're telling a story, other than just yes, no, or something like that. So it's so important for, once again, our young, and for us, you think second about what is coming out of what are you saying, what is the meaning, how are you weaving it. It just makes you much more conscious about and present, and we're all about
Mhm.
being present. So I love that about it too.
It's not just about making sense of things with stories, it's the fact that we are story, we are
Yes.
being storied by
Yeah.
story. For me, story is life, life story.
Right. And maybe how do I want to change this story? Or this part of my story isn't working. Or how many times do you hear someone say, well, what do you think? What do you want your story to look like? And well, they usually say, 5 years. Where do you want to be in 5 years? What you're really asking is, what do you want your story to be in 5 years? And then you get into the whole time loop where you can create what you want. But that's a whole nother topic.
Well, what you're doing is engaging with that quest structure. There are 18 different story structures that I describe in the book. We just looked at one of those.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mentioned the threshold crossing ones, there's a whole group of those, but the quest structure is that story structure you follow when you think, where do I want to be in 5 years' time? That's my problem. I don't know. Okay, what do I do? I'm going to go on an internal journey,
Exactly. Yeah.
meet some ideas. I'm going to use my imagination as my friend and helper. I'm going to defeat the sense of insecurity, of ignorance, all that's
Fear.
going to go because I'm going to have a clearer idea. Maybe I sit there for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, a whole day, nothing comes up. So I'm back at the same problem again. What do? I find a different friend or helper. I go to the I Ching. I do a reading. And that maybe gives me an insight that I didn't have before. As a result, I can go back and think, right, now with this insight, I have greater clarity, but I need to have a clear plan. What are the practical steps I can take to get me from A to B? And then you plan it, you have to carry that plan out. In the carrying out of the plan, you adjust as you go, but you're always going through iterations of that basic quest structure. As you follow a pattern round, which goes doubt, 3 steps: doubt, confirmation, affirmation. They're the same things, back to the series of 3, listen out for it, that underlie the very famous Latin saying by Julius Caesar, veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered.
Mm.
Why did I come? Because there was a doubt, a rumor. I needed to check it out for myself. When I came, I saw with my own eyes. That's the confirmation. As a result, I put a plan in place, I carried it out, I put it into action, and I conquered. Affirmation,
Mhm.
affirmative action, done.
Wow. Love it.
That's another story structure that I
Yes, I can't wait to get this book. I'm very intrigued. Well, we need to wrap it up here, but thank you so much for reaching out to me. I love having conversations like this. No one's ever asked me questions. I'm usually the one that's asking the questions, so that was really fun. Leon, if people want to find you, you've already said a little bit, but what is the best way to find you, contact you?
look for me online, visit my website, leonconrad.com.
Great. And that will be in the show notes. Well, thank you so much. You're in the UK. So what time is it there? In the evening?
Right now, it is coming up to 6 o'clock in the evening.
Evening. You drink coffee at 6 o'clock in the evening? You said you had a cup of coffee.
I do.
Okay.
It's going to be a glass of wine later on, but
Yeah, yeah, a
yeah.
little bit later. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it and can't wait to get the book.
Thank you, Marla. Lovely to
Okay.
be here. And thank you for a great conversation. Hope
Yes,
your listeners got something out of it.
I'm sure they will. And have a great evening.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.